certainly happy to be here, and thank you for having me. And we're going to take a look at a rather odd range of topics today, including puppies, it would seem. And we're going to look at space textiles in the sense that I have a project that's been ongoing now for several years, where investigations into textiles and apparel needs and constraints for long-duration space travel have led to a research project, well, here on Earth. And the rather interesting conclusion that one really is the other, that there really isn't a separation between the two, and that perhaps even more importantly, the space research may actually be a very good way to focus our attention on the things that need to be focused on the home planet. So next slide, please. So the story starts 10 years ago when I became involved in a project that was funded by DARPA in 2012 called the 100-Year Starship, which is led by the astronaut Dr. Mae Jemison. DARPA needed us to form a team that would enable human spaceflight out of the solar system by 2112, hence the 100 years. And our job obviously was neither to build the craft nor be on it, but rather to assemble all the necessary knowledge to make it available to whoever at the time, probably starting in 2080 or something like that, would decide to get that mission going. So to make a long story short, very soon after May had been handed the keys to this project, I got in touch with her and wondered if anyone was thinking about such mundane things as textiles. And the answer came back very quickly that no, there was no one doing that, and could I please come down to Houston and start working with them, and so I did. Now, we've been at it for the last 10 years. We had a little bit of a hiatus for the pandemic, but I just got back from Kenya. We had our the 100-Year Starship conference in Nairobi just a few weeks ago, and so we're back on the road, as it were, and moving along pretty quickly. And so the project continues, but has now achieved something that was May's intent all along, and hence Kenya, to be a more global and inclusive project. And with the global and inclusive comes a responsibility to examine it from a variety of viewpoints, and some of those lead us actually, as I said, back to research projects that are very, very earthbound. And some of you are probably already knowing where this is going, that the ability to maintain life in space actually tells us what we need to maintain life on Earth. And so it becomes about closed loop ecosystems very, very quickly. Next slide, please. So the beginning at the University of Rhode Island, the year after, we got some funding from the Council of Research here, where we started mapping this project out, and I and a team of students went into the technology and design side of the textiles and apparel of long-duration exploration in general, not just in space. So we were going up and down the historical record of the age of big ships and Antarctica, and submarines. Nuclear submarines during the Cold War were the closest thing we could really find to what would be long-duration space travel. And we even had one student sort of pulling things out of popular culture imagery in terms of how these things were dealt with there. And no surprise to a group such as you, of course, nobody seemed to see any problems with the fact that in science fiction, nobody ever seems to take care of their clothing or even change it. So that was ultimately not very helpful, except in that way that it pointed to a certain pop culture representation of textiles and clothing that in an odd kind of way our project had to overcome before becoming viable. Next slide. Now, just here, I just wanted to show you just very quickly that when you get into this kind of research in space, space is no more one place or one kind of place than if you were doing research for clothing on Earth or in any locale beyond sort of your immediate neighborhood. It's not one place. There are different contexts, there are different missions, there are different communities, and I'll get into that in a moment. But just to show you here a matrix that was set up early on in the program, there were 40 different ways just of looking at the resupply problem, depending on where you actually were and whether you were looking to resupply through traditional resupply in having resources placed somewhere, or whether you were actually manufacturing clothing or your textile goods on the Starship or on the Mars base, whether you were focused on durability in terms of maintenance, whether you were thinking of the long duration life cycle in terms of repurposing textiles and textile goods, or you were actually recycling the components and materials, which is, as you may know, the least efficient method of doing this. You really want to keep the duration in there. So long-term wear, long-term use became the thing, but eventually things need to be resupplied. And I should point out how a Mars base just suddenly showed up there. Fairly early on in the project, we started using Mars, as odd as that may sound, as a stepping stone in the project. The Starship itself, with current technology, is a mission of several thousand people traveling for 40, 50 years, and trying to discuss that on some logical level with people that weren't members of the research team. There's really no other way of saying it. Kind of freaked people out. And people found it rather hard to discuss. So we started using Mars as a first step, as almost an analog. If we could solve it for Mars, we could solve it for the longer duration mission. And so Mars creeps in pretty fast. Next slide. So very quickly, the textile and apparel question, and when I say textiles, it largely in terms of a spacecraft or a space station, we really are thinking bedding and insulation, and then basically your clothing. There's not an awful lot of the sort of finer points that we were looking at, since the finer points wouldn't really be there until there were a community, until there were an active culture on a planet's surface, or on a starship itself, or maybe on a base hovering around Jupiter or something like that. But a couple of things very quickly come to mind, and there are several questions that had to be answered. For example, that on a space station you don't have weather, and you don't really have a lot of dust. You got plenty of bacteria, however, but you don't have dust, you don't have weather, you don't have a lot of attrition, as it were. There's bumping and scraping, people floating around in microgravity. But the weather question is a really interesting one when it comes to thinking about how to kit people out in terms of clothing. Any sort of sense of nationality, any sort of localized culture is going to have to be negotiated, because now obviously you have an environment of no culture, if you will. Or if you do, well, whose culture is that going to be? Who gets to decide? Whose look becomes the official look? And these are things that we were actually talking about in Kenya just a couple of weeks ago, especially in terms of the kind of globalizing issues that we were thinking of. Once you have participants in a mission like this, whose culture is, shall we say, very non-Western, things change. But this is a multi-generational mission in the end, and so family structures, and so any kind of learning and acculturization around textiles and clothing that come from family structures and kinship will change. Earthly references will be quickly removed. It takes only 1 or 2 generations for expatriates to change their cultural modes. So you can imagine the same thing will happen when you're removed from the planet altogether. There's a number of food questions that I'm sure could become obvious. And then, of course, ritual and religion, people's experiences are important and will have to be accommodated, and how that happens in terms of day-to-day practices of clothing and food. Also, as you can imagine, these go hand in hand, are something that would have to be actually planned. One thing that space programs, whether it's not NASA or others, are very big on, the phrase the term team cohesion comes up a lot at this point. And human beings, being what they are, will often let very large things go by, but it's the small things that become the irritants. And so if your socks aren't working, or your bedding is no good, or your team members' clothing hygiene leaves something to be desired, that could become a breakpoint for the team, and that's dangerous in a dangerous situation, whether it's in space or in a military operation, or Antarctica, or on board a long nuclear submarine mission. But we also, just like seasons and weather, would not have days, would not have years, or at least they would be artificially measured. They would not be measured by seasons or by the sun or moon, obviously. And so in terms of human practices, things would have to be very quickly organized in a way that humans have not been accustomed to organizing for thousands of years. And I would point out at this point that I am a designer with a background in theater, so identity and costume is very big for me. But I'm also an anthropologist of material culture and an ethnographer. And so human behavior and human culture is very big on this. And I'm very fortunate in this project. I get to wear all of those hats. I get to look at this from a design point of view. I get to look at it from a anthropological point of view. I get to look at it from an ethnographic point of view in terms of small group cultures and nationalities. And this will become important in a moment while I'm talking here. Now, artificial intelligence is big these days. We're all talking about AI. And there may be some issues here in terms of how humans operate in long-duration space travel that relies on some combination of human and machine interaction. And it's not entirely clear where this is going, but the idea that human operations may actually be fairly static. And so that may be something that clothing would reflect. You don't need a broad range of clothing types because you're not really doing all that much. And early on in the project, we played with the idea of what would be the minimum, absolute minimum of clothing needed, because obviously the payload question is big. It costs currently $10,000 to put a pound of material into space. So that becomes a very expensive t-shirt once it reaches the ISS. And so what is the minimum amount of clothing? And it's actually not a lot. It really is. It's exercise wear, essentially. People like to be covered. And in microgravity especially, you're always bumping up against something. So it's nice to have a little textile interface there. Next slide, please. So you may ask, what will they wear? Indeed. And now one interesting thing, that came up very early was as the ISS is up there, the International Space Station is up there longer, we realize how problematic radiation is. The gamma ray radiation, the cosmic rays, if you will, are more powerful and more damaging than was initially thought. Humans have not dwelt for that long in space that it's been very hard to monitor and measure this. And so once we started relatively recently having astronauts on the ISS for hundreds of days, 300 days, 400 days, 500 days, you could start measuring the actual physical effects on this, and they are not good. So one of the things that becomes very important in terms of textile development for space travel, and this is the perfect audience to put this in front of, because it has not really been solved yet, is the idea of lightweight but powerful radiation protection, so that you're not suiting up for radiation. You're just your normal everyday T-shirt, exercise wear. Look at Suni there on the picture. That's there. She's in the sort of minimal clothing, the corporate picnic wear, as we call it. She's wearing the branded T-shirt and the shorts, and but ideally she should be wearing long sleeves and long pants, and her bedding should probably be protective as well. So if you could produce a thin, lightweight, cotton-feeling fabric that is effective at bouncing off gamma rays, you're onto something. So let me just put that in front of you. This may be embedded carbon in polyester fibers, rather, and so I tend to make a bad joke of it every now and then, and point out that the color scheme in space is going to be your basic 90s hipster. We'll all be wearing black and gray in space. But the fabrics need also be extremely durable for reasons that I mentioned before. They would also, ideally, when we get to the Starship or Mars-based stage, be immensely reusable or recyclable. And one thing that NASA is pushing right now is embedded technologies. So they would like the garments to have in them health monitoring devices, communications devices, so that there can be constant monitoring of astronaut health, and that communication does not rely on external devices that need to be put on and taken off in an emergency. Obviously, the clothing types are going to be dependent on the organizational structure of the mission. Is it a military mission? Is it a government mission? Is it a corporate mission? Is it multinational? We're seeing a breakdown now of the multinational cooperation that has been prevalent in space for the past few decades, so that's worrisome. But then, of course, the big deal in space exploration now is not of the necessarily strictly scientific kind, but you're looking at people with mining aspirations. And so the protective gear there would not necessarily mean nobody's mining in the rock. These are all people that would be on board ships. But what does that mean? What kind of comfort level? Again, what kind of radiation protection out in deep space? And or the length of time that people would be dwelling would be extended quite radically. We would have to think about what kind of social structures are there. The wavelengths, I saw the question pop up there. Sorry, I'll just answer it because I saw it. I know we're going to do this afterward. But the wavelengths these are gamma rays. They're very, very powerful and short wavelengths. So there would be social structures involved, depending on whether it's, as I said, military, corporate, size of corporation, and so forth. Are people going to be worried about gender identities in clothing? Are they going to be worried about national identities in clothing? Are there hierarchies involved that need to be seen at a distance in a military way? And will there be any onboard production capabilities? And if you are sending people on a starship out beyond the Oort clouds, yes, you're going to have onboard production and repair capabilities if you do not have 100% durable fabrics. So there's a certain sort of medievalness to all of this, where quite the opposite of the fast fashion model we have today. And now spoiler alert, we're getting to the Earthbound project in a second. The idea that things are going to have to be very durable on a starship that has left Earth, that is not coming back, and is not really landing anywhere, also means that everything that goes on that ship now belongs to the ship. And the ship is an organism. The ship is a circular economy. Anything that goes on that ship had better well stay on that ship. You can't have too much leakage of resources. And so that, human bodies included. You can't throw a dead body out the airlock. You're going to lose all the resources that went into maintaining that body. There's a lot of water, there's a lot of protein, there's a lot of calcium, and who knows what else there. So the body's going to have to be deconstructed and fed to the tomatoes or whatever. But same goes for the fabrics. You would have to be able to think of them as really molecules going in a circle. And yes, I see the flammability. Yes, the flammability is a big issue, but not as big as you'd think. Not as big as you'd think in terms of things like clothing and bedding. Because the fire protection protocols are so strict that it sounds a little bit grim, but by the time you get to worrying about the clothing and bedding in terms of flammability, you'd probably be dead anyway. So it's not really an issue, and nobody is playing with open flames. There is no smoking or anything like that. So if you've got a fire that serious at that point, it's beyond worrying about whether your T-shirt is burning. Next slide, please. Quickly, and just a little plug there, a little in-house plug. You can go back and see some more about this back in 2017 when we finished the first round of investigations at URI. This is there were 3 articles in the review there that were basically reviewing the whole thing. But very quickly, the laundry problem became the primary focus because nobody has actually, and again, a delightful audience to presenting this to, nobody has actually figured out a way to properly do laundry in space at any volume. There's a video from, gosh, it must be now 8 or 10 years ago, but one of the commanders on the ISS is washing his exercise shorts by putting his hand in a plastic bag with an elastic around it and actually hand washing his shorts in a little bit of water and soap. That's about as good as it gets up there. There was a contract right about the time we were starting this research that was supposed to result in an actual washing machine for the ISS, but it didn't pan out. And the water issues, the gravity issues, seem more difficult than anyone imagined. So that's a fun thing to think about. But how to keep everything clean? Hygiene is a big deal. And so ideally, any fabrics that are developed for long duration space travel would also probably have antimicrobial capabilities. You know that better than I do, that the antimicrobial capabilities have been problematic when they're tried. But anything that can keep us from having to use the water and to produce gray water is worth it. People don't sweat a lot in space stations. It's climate controlled. And something about the effects of microgravity actually changes that part of your metabolism. So there's not a lot of sweat, but eventually, especially if you're wearing a lot of polyester, you know how that works, body odor does show up. So it's nice to, the antimicrobial would help with that. But I guess there's no getting around the laundry, so that's going to be a problem. This is a big, you see there down there, psychological well-being matters. We are very tuned to that. And human beings today more so than even just some decades ago. So maybe it's a question of acculturizing to a little more tolerance, but also there is a health issue involved, as you know, and so the problem of laundry is a really difficult one. Vacuum cleaner for dead cells. Yes, good. Yeah, sure. You know, plenty of vacuum, and pun intended. I really wonder, you know, hanging stuff in an airlock and just letting the deadness of space take care of it for a little while might be the equivalent of when I was growing up in Iceland, where you would take your wool sweater and just hang it outside in the winter cold and snow for a while, and that would take care of it. Never have to wash an Icelandic wool sweater. Next slide, please. So we wound up with a lot of different needs, and there could be an issue in terms of behavioral patterns, but the human needs and the structures, the technical solutions, the technical needs, these all started leading to a more sort of human need, human culture, behavioral side of things. And that's where my anthropological ethnographic hat started to show up. Next slide, please. So the problem really is we're going to send a whole bunch of people into space to be there. And I emphasize be in a very sort of philosophical sense. We're sending a bunch of people to dwell off the planet. This has not happened before in human history. The few people who have dwelt for a few hundred days on the ISS have come back changed. They don't make a lot of noise about this, but they have come back changed. The nature of their being, their nature of their approach to their own identity and existence. For some larger, almost dangerously large, for some smaller, that's fine. But this does seem to be a very interesting moment for the human psyche. And so in terms of clothing and behavior, this is actually something that we have to model on Earth before we send people out. So all the research, all the effectiveness of things has to be proven, obviously. We can't send people out there and just, here's your bag, good luck, do right, and then let them just figure it out. That would be a little scary. Next slide, please. So we really had to go deep into the constraints and needs that would guide the planning for this. And I know it started with laundry, and it started with what kind of socks are we going to wear. But really, in those first 2 years, this escalated into an investigation of the concept of being human in terms of these things we do. And you know as well as I, given your professions, how most of us take the things related to clothing and textiles for granted. People don't understand. How can there be a whole science devoted to this? There are clothes. They magically appear in stores. We buy them, we wear them, we throw them away. And this idea that we have to rethink an entire culture in order to put 1,000 people onto another planet can be a little bit surprising. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the ethnography for a second. Let me put my ethnographer hat on. Next slide. So looking at clothing, let's think about some basic things. Let's think of clothing not as textiles or as fashion or style. Let's think of it as experience. Let's think of the being with, the putting something on and existing in it. So if we're sending people off into space for 40 years or for a lifetime, or onto Mars for a 5-year mission, and we're saying, no, you're not going to get to do any of this creative stuff. You're not going to improvise because that's dangerous. There's no nature to interact with. We're not sending you with any knitting needles or sewing needles or extra fabrics or anything at all. You're not going to get to observe your traditions. You're not going to get to have any rituals of getting dressed for this or not dressed for that. This happens, of course, in prisons. This happens in the military up to a point. But people start to improvise really fast. Any of you who went to a school where there were school uniforms knows what I'm talking about. And so what we really have to start thinking about is, if we're going to save people from going absolutely bonkers in their first couple of months or first year on a long duration mission like this, we have to understand what this actually means. And next slide, please. And I can tell you, for example, I don't think I have a slide on this. If I do, it'll come up later, but I don't think I put it in here. Back when the first space station went up, when Skylab went up in the 1970s, there was a crew revolt. 3 crew members on Skylab got so fed up with having to wear the same 1970s colored drab coveralls, and that the 3 of them all looked the same, that they started, they did a sit-down strike, if you will, if you can do a sit-down strike in microgravity. They stopped shaving, they started improvising, they refused to do certain tasks that ground control set them. It was heading for a disaster. This was because of 3 people in the space of a week. Now imagine a community of maybe a few hundred or 1,000 over the course of a year. Nobody wants to be a robot. Nobody wants to be invisible in a crowd. 3 astronauts revolted. So clothing matters. And in a sense, and I alluded to this earlier, it's not about designing clothes. It's about designing a system. It's about designing a system in which the fabrics, the garments, the circular economy, the recycling, the radiation protection, the comfort, the warmth, the identity, the gender issues, on and on and on and on, all work in a way that supports the team, supports their health, supports the mission, and stays on the flight. So we're looking at needs and constraints of small group culture. What does it mean to isolate a village-sized community like that and make it work? There's almost I was going to say horror movie, but let's call it a sci-fi movie in the making there. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I've been bringing to people a lot and have been talking about a lot lately is this idea that part of the space mission culture, and we did talk about this in Kenya quite a bit the other day. Let me back up a second. Part of a problem with space travel culture now, in terms of its approach to things and mundane things like hygiene and clothing and food, is that this is all grown up in a military culture. This was all part of the Cold War, whether it was on the Soviet side or the US side. And space exploration and space travel still retains that genealogy of military culture, if you will. And needless to say, modernist culture, from which space travel arrived in the late 1950s, early 1960s, was very big on science and technology. And all of Western culture did this, separated the arts and the sciences somewhere soon after the Renaissance. And we might have to come back to a training that allows these two to meet again, where in terms of maintaining your person, maintaining your clothing, maintaining your bedding, maintaining your habitat, means that you as the scientist, you also need to be an artist. You need to have the craft knowledge. You need to be a craftsperson. In the old meaning of the word artist that we now use in the word artisan, the Greeks had 2 terms. They talked about techne and episteme. They talked about the knowledge how, about the doing of, the wisdom of the fingertips that my grandmother, the seamstress, used to talk about. On the other hand, you have episteme, the book knowledge, the knowledge the knowledge of what we call science. So there's craft and science. We've separated these things into almost two worlds. Imagine this. Imagine a narrowing of that gap, where just as on the big sailing ships in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, 19th century, every crew member was responsible for their things. There would be sewing circles and knitting circles on the ships. I've even seen a theory where sea shanties are not just about rowing, they're about the rhythm of darning and the rhythm of knitting. Try singing a sea shanty next time you sew something, if any of you sew by hand. I ask the astronauts that, who in here can knit, and it's always only May's hand that goes up. I have a picture of Karen, her last name escapes me right now, but she took quilts with her to space. That was very nice. But we need to maybe think of this in a cultural way of narrowing that gap so that the craft of maintaining and the craft that allows the durability of the textile product becomes important. Next slide. So yes, just a little reminder of what it means to live on Earth. Henry Glassy, the ethnographer, would create a world full of textures and scents. And I love that idea of the cool feel of linoleum on the kitchen floor and the smells of bacon frying. Now imagine living in an environment on a space station or Mars where you cannot do that at all, where you have none of this. You have no textures, you have no scents, you have no pets, you have no randomness. And maybe the only thing that keeps you sane, the only thing that keeps you human is that handcraft, might be the textile craft. Next slide. Actually, that's, yes, sorry. So when the old world is gone, those reference points are also gone. And it's entirely possible that within 2 or 3 generations, right about the time somebody could stand on Mars and watch the Earth go across the sun like that, these earthly things will not be recognizable in the same way that a 3rd generation of immigrant families know perhaps very little of the village culture that the grandparents left. Next slide. So what can we learn? What do we need to bring? What is this human world that we are going to put on the Starship or try and exist in, orbiting around Jupiter or living on the surface of Mars? Next slide, please. The poet Nikki Giovanni points out to us that we don't really have to bring culture. We have to bring what we do. And so one of the things we have started focusing on from an ethnographic point of view is what is it that matters to people? What do we really value in terms of the things we wear, in terms of the toys we carry, in terms of the bedding we sleep in? Next slide, please. So that final point there, we are the creators of our culture. Our environments reflect us. If we can't provide this for these long-duration astronauts, we are going to be sending them into a mental space that is dangerous. And so with that, the idea of creativity really comes to the front in terms of not just what we can do, but what we have to provide these Voyagers with. So given that, yes, I just asked you to think about anti-radiation fabrics, durable fabrics, comfortable fabrics, warm fabrics, but now what can you do with them? What are the parameters inside those that allow for that individual identity creation, that allow for that flight of imagination, that allow for some malleability? Next slide, please. So we look at modes of being. We need to think about the language of existing with these products. They're not bought off the rack. They're not just magically appearing in stores. The importance of a single shirt may be the difference between somebody's mental well-being and not. So how do you actually even try to provide that? Or do you try to provide something else that takes its place? Next slide, please. Oh, there she is. I just threw that in there. There's Karen with her quilting on the ISS, which I thought was a really good illustration of why people actually need to do this. Next slide, please.
No.
So,
it's this Space and Textiles and Space thing. It's not that bad.
It's not that bad, no. I can hear somebody speaking there. Okay, thank you. So let's bring this now back to Earth. Given all of that, given all of this, what does that mean if we transfer this to Earth? What if there is no Starship? What if there is no Mars base? What can we do here on Earth that reflects this thinking? Next slide, please. So we're in trouble. We're talking about sending people to distant stars or living on Mars or orbiting the moons of Jupiter. At the same time, our planet is in deep trouble. We are in deep trouble. Our planet is probably fine. Our textile production, our textile habits, our culture is killing us. Among other things that are killing us, it now turns out that the pollution of our textile use and production is far worse than we thought it was. Yes, we have cleaned up a lot of rivers. Yes, we have moved textile mills to other parts of the world so we don't see them and therefore it doesn't bother us. But then at the same time, we're realizing that the plastics that we have now put into the environment everywhere, are everywhere. So none of this is going anywhere. We're not getting a lot of help at the moment. So for me, the space travel project has actually decided to stay home for a while. And as a department chair of a textile department in a land-grant university, I would be, to put it mildly, embarrassed, if not ashamed, if this were not the remainder of my career. And that's what I'm going to make it. Next slide, please. You probably know these statistics better than anyone, but the water use is frightening. And so obviously, if you think about it, this from a space travel point of view, it's absolutely absurd. Textile production, by the means we use here on Earth, are, in other words, impossible. There is no way we can do this. We cannot use the kind of magical thinking that seems to be in abundance right now, where, oh yeah, this is all out there somewhere. There's an icy moon. We'll get its water. Okay, hotshot, show me how you're going to do that. Then we'll talk. Next slide, please. And yes, we are basically, with our synthetics, with our laundry detergents, with our various methods of treating, creating, growing, caring for, discarding our textiles, killing ourselves. So there's no real other way of saying that. Next slide, please. Same point. You know this. Next slide, please. Now, an interesting side effect, an interesting side story is that, of course, this is not localized to Rhode Island or to anywhere. This is a global problem. And so thinking of solving it for an individual place is really a way of creating a model of a solution for us elsewhere. So if we can solve a circular economy for Rhode Island, we have created at least a model of solution that could perhaps be, say, moved to Ghana. We had a delegation from Ghana here at the university recently. They have an enormous plastic bottle waste problem there. The Nkrumah Technical University produces several tons every month of plastic bottles. And the idea that we might help them deal with that is very attractive. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, yes, that's just a little way of transporting Ghana into this problem. Next slide. So, one of the things we are now working on and starting, well, now, this term, this spring, is to start looking at a circular textile production ecosystem that uses waste plastic as raw material. In other words, those plastic bottles are not waste, the definition of waste being simply material in the wrong place. That's a resource. What you see there is not a cleanup crew on a beach in Ghana. What you see there is a resource gathering crew mining for raw materials. Next slide, please. So we have a 7-year project in the making, as I say, starting right now. The first step, among others, is a class I'm teaching called From Mars to South County, creating a circular textiles economy in Rhode Island here at URI. So for the next year or so, we'll be mapping and modeling this in a very sort of wargaming kind of way, looking for solutions, creating maps, looking for the breakpoints and the input points and so forth. 24 to 26, we'll be looking for prototypes and trying sort of figuring out where we can find gaps and ways to insert things and wondering about what markets might be available. We'll have to iterate until we get there. And then coming up to the latter half of this decade into 2030, we will probably find a point where we start putting a product or products on the market. We may have some military cooperation here, since they have a very focused kind of product use that will allow us to have a very tightly focused supply chain, recycle chain, reuse chain, before we release it to the general public. Next slide, please. So the outcome is really a process rather than products. The products are no joke intended, byproducts of the process we're trying to figure out. So we want to find a working model. We're basically trying to put our money where our mouths are, our mouths where our money is, trying to create a closed loop textile production process with minimal impact on a discrete watershed. So it's the Rhode Island watershed rather than Rhode Island state. So we're going to have to be invading Connecticut and Massachusetts as well. How do we close those gaps? And then out of that, of course, because we actually have to have products to field test, we might have one or more field tested products that will have, hopefully, some kind of environmental, economic, and social impact in being a model for a viable solution elsewhere. Next slide, please. Just a slide here to point out the Ghanaian solution as an interesting place to go, where it really is only, a yard of basic t-shirt fabric, basic polyester, is only 9 bottles. And so you can get 4,000 yards of fabric out of a ton of plastic bottles. And so the Ghanaian University, the Nkrumah Technical College, actually, they could start their own t-shirt industry just on the water bottles that their students use. I mean, they have a terrible drinking water problem there, so everybody drinks out of these bottles. It was interesting to note, by the way, when I was in Kenya just a few weeks ago, all the water bottles are glass. They're all reusable. Plastic water bottles are illegal in Kenya. It's illegal to, even when you travel there, to bring a plastic bag into the country, which I found heartening. But anyway, polyester is polyester, as it says there, and if you can get it into the stream, you can then work on keeping it in the stream. And we're going to try and do this, like I say, over the next 7 years. Next slide, please. You know this. This audience is probably very good at this. You can have the input in so many places if it is a loop. And so we will be working with manufacturers. We will be working with the sourcing from the waste streams. Wouldn't it be interesting if a Rhode Island textile manufacturer actually wound up buying barges of plastic bottles from Africa? It would be an interesting turnaround, wouldn't it? Maybe the input comes from previously used textiles or previously used garments. But the relationship to the Mars base, to the Starship, starts to show up here. This is the spaceship. Once it's in the loop, it has to stay in the loop. It cannot leak out. There cannot be pollutants. There cannot be loss of material, biological or technological. Next slide, please. Just there, a slightly more complex diagram. This is a diagram for Rhode Island. The slightly complicating the previous diagram, but that's all. It doesn't really have any other information. Next slide, please. So at URI right now, we have a team that, or the team is forming rather, in engineering, from textiles, from business, from marine sciences, oceanography. There are business analysts and entrepreneurs. And I'm putting this slide up. If any of you listening would like to be added to this list, I would welcome hearing from you. Next slide, please. So the potential products, to go into that just a little bit more deeply before I finish. Out of a 7-year project like this, which could be 7 to 10, depending on behavior, new consumer products, new visions of local production. This is the important one. There's a lot of educational opportunities here. So even as we go, this is a good opportunity to educate from the K through 12 and upward, educate populations, educate everyone. We have a local model. We can mitigate the waterway pollution. We hopefully will come up with new methods of the 4 Rs. And for goodness sake, we got to think about the ocean plastics. And of course, anything that upscales communication between disciplines is welcome. Next slide, please. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I went a little over time. I hope that was okay. And let's see your questions.
Thank you, Karl. That was great. We do have quite a few questions. We will start
fire away.
Sort of towards the beginning. So the question that Apurva actually asked earlier was around the wavelengths of cosmic rays, and I believe you mentioned there were gamma rays, right?
Yeah. So pretty high intensity. That is as anyone who knows what this means. It is the fact that they are really powerful, intense rays that is a problem. Yeah.
And one of the comments from Nelson Hauser was, could we use graphene for radiation protection?
Yes, that's exactly where most of the science seems to be heading right now. I haven't seen any successful field testing, but that's where that's one of the things that's being looked at. Yes.
I was going to mention just before Nelson Hauser, I think John mentioned how to achieve highly efficient recyclable fabric clothing that is on slide 10.
Let's go back to that slide. See what is happening. There we go, slide 10, here we go. Well, one of the things that came out of discussions in Kenya the other week was that we really need to go back to basics. And this is something we talked about early on in the Starship project, but kind of got snowed over a little bit as we were looking into the myriad things we needed to look into. I remember mentioning to my students in that first stage of the project that was on one of the slides, the 2013-2014 project, I asked the grad students working with me to imagine that human beings had never worn clothing ever. And now, for some godforsaken reason, because we're sending them to space, we find it necessary to cover human bodies in textiles. Take it from there. There's a lot of things that we have become accustomed to in the last 40,000 years as a species. Not a lot of them are going to work. So we kind of have to go back to real basics. And I'm afraid that's the answer right now. But it's fun to sit in front of a group like this and present that challenge.
So as you think about traditional textile manufacturing, knits and wovens, I mean, it's a huge footprint.
Yes.
To create the fibers, to create the yarns, and then knitting, weaving, dyeing, finishing, cutting, sewing. Has there been thoughts around using non-woven materials more as a solution here, where you go straight from polymer to fabric?
Yes.
Skip everything in between.
Polymers, mushroom-based, you name it. There's been a lot of talk of that, because obviously the spinning, weaving, cutting model is going to be a tricky one to transport. Some way of pre-manufacture might be workable while the communities are small and close by. And Mars is still, in this framing, still considered close by. Even though a Mars mission is several hundred days, once you get beyond that, you're really, pun intended, in a different world. Once you get beyond Mars, once you get beyond the Earth-Moon system, you're really in a different world. But once you get beyond Mars, you're for all intents and purposes, for what we're talking about today, in science fiction territory. And so the ideal thing would be something like a spray on something or other made of an organic base that could then be stripped off and repurposed, put back into the vat, fed to the tomatoes, I don't know what, but I'm not seeing it just yet.
That's why it's a 100-year plan, right?
That's what you're planning. I'm going to be 60 this year, so luckily I'm not going to have to stand there in 2112 and say, I don't know, go find the mushrooms, you know?
Mary Ballard asks, would supercritical fluids work? And I think and Mary, I'm not sure if you're still in the call. Would you like to offer some context to that question?
It's what they use to they use it to decaffeinate coffee, but it can work for fabrics, and people have been trying it out, but in small quantities.
How clean?
How have they been?
I think cleaning, yeah.
Yeah, for cleaning.
Cleaning.
Yeah.
And it takes mostly soils away.
Yeah.
Rather than.
Like I said, soils are the least of our worries. Obviously, people can, drop their dinner and coffee and whatever they got onto their clothing and so forth. But for the most part, it is the body fluids that need to be dealt with. So if it's only spot cleaning in that sense, then that might actually be a way to prolong this. It would be an interesting experiment to do. And we did a couple of experiments. And we did have an experiment running in a Mars simulator for a while, in terms of how far you can stretch these things. But I wish I had an hour to tell you a story of the Mars simulator experiment. There were significant other human factors that got in the way of that being a successful experiment. Let me put it that way. Behavioral issues. Let's just let it rest there. Next question, please.
The next question is from Kanti. What do you say about the 3D structures that can readily contain AI communication devices?
Yes, embedded technology is big. Being able to print out fabric swatches with embedded technologies is something we're actually seeing happen here on campus right now. The textile scientist here in our department is using 3D printers. The engineering department is doing all sorts of embedded technology stuff. I think that's going to be very component based when we start doing that as a production thing. I can see where you would have sort of hot swappable textile patches or something where you could, depending on the time of day or whatever you needed to do. I guess because we heard coffee mentioned earlier, think of it as a coffee filter. You slip into a place on your garment, and now you have your AI there, or your heart monitor there, or your radiation monitor there, that kind of thing.
Just a couple of comments. Margaret says, to have one of those replicators a la Star Trek series.
They always come up sooner or later.
And Avi says, alien capsule suit.
Alien capsule suits. What is an alien capsule suit?
I'm not quite sure, but he gave a thumbs up.
Okay.
Oh, that was a proba. Avi also asked, do you have psychological data from space to begin with?
If by observation of the kind of team cohesion stuff that I was talking about, yes, that is available. Not all of it is publicly available. NASA guards this very, very well. So does the European space program, the Japanese space program, and the Soviets, or the Russians. Space programs, like military operations, are very, very careful to not let you inside the problematic sides of their missions, I'm sorry to say. And so things like psychological data are very carefully guarded, but you can tell somehow, you can read between the lines quite a lot. And so yes, there is a lot available out there. And the experiment that we ran in the Mars simulator out in the Utah desert also showed us some highly problematic things around humans in isolated, closed environments that go well beyond textile problems.
I think Avi had a follow-up question. Are there any lab capabilities to check high-tech fabrics with humans?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
Are there any lab capabilities to check high-tech fabrics with humans?
Meaning putting humans into an observable environment using these things?
Yeah, with those fabrics on their bodies.
Yeah, that would be a good thing to do in one of those space station simulators. What we did on the Mars simulator was we were looking at the hygiene issues. So there was a crew that went into a Mars base. There's a couple of these around the world, and they went into and so they behave as if they are in a Mars station. There's a time lag on communications and all this stuff. And then the crew kept journals for us on their hygiene practices and dress practices and so forth. You could do the same there, certainly. You could apply to any of these high seas or any of these space station simulators to get that done.
Awesome.
Next question from Nelson Hauser is around cleaning. Is it possible to use IR or UV treatment of circulated air or garments for cleaning of bacteria? And I would also add to that ozone.
Yes.
Use ozone to clean?
I know that some of the companies that were trying to create a quote-unquote laundry machine for the ISS were playing with UV and ultrasound and such. And I'm not entirely sure why that was deemed unsuccessful, to tell you the truth. These are heavily guarded proprietary secrets, but none of them actually came to fruition. So I'm not 100% sure why this would not be considered a good idea.
Right. It's almost a type of dry cleaning, right? Where you don't have to use any water at all.
You'd think it would be, sure, let's just, UV the crap out of it, so to speak. but for some reason didn't go all the way. And I have not been able to find out because these are proprietary. This proprietary information.
And next question is from Kanti. Is there any collaboration with the Chinese space programs?
Not in our. Did you mean strictly in my project, or in a larger sense?
I would think as it relates to textiles, yes.
No, there is not at the moment, and the answer is no and no anyway. So, in a larger sense, no, not really. No, sadly, the level of cooperation from China, well, with China, I'm sure it's not a one-sided thing, but sadly, the willingness to cooperate between the United States and China has not been good, and as you probably all know, is at a low point right now.
We are at the end of our questions. We do have quite a few comments about how they really enjoyed the presentation. Very thought-provoking. Thank you very much. And we do have just a couple of extra slides here at the end. This is from AATCC, and Maria, I'm not sure if you want to talk about these or if you want Apurva and I.
I did want to ask Dr. Aspelund if it's okay to put his PDF up on our community's site. It would be members only.
Yes, I think that's okay. Tell you what, let me go in before you do that, and I think there might be one or two images there that I would want to put care of NASA or copyright NASA on them before you do that. But
okay,
I'll do that, and I'll send you a new PDF.
That sounds good. Sure. And I will be putting the recording of this up on that site unless you have any objections.
Nope, that's great. Let's do that.
Okay. I will put a link to that recording. I think some folks were asking about that. I'll put a link to this recording up on the new community site so that folks can enjoy re-watching.
Very good.
All right. And if you want to narrate, Christina or Apurva, I don't have any
Sure.
skin in this game about the upcoming education stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I can go ahead. So we have some upcoming 2023 AATCC education events. Online is the Standard Detergent, a fresh spin on March 9th. December 13th through 14th is Haptics and Textiles. In-person events, we have PFAS and Textiles Conference down in Durham, North Carolina, July 11th through 12th. And we also have the Textile Discovery Summit. This year will be held in Greenville, South Carolina, September 12th through 14th. All of these events can be found with more information on aatcc.org/events. And we encourage you to go online and check them out and register if you're interested. And Purvi, you want to take the next slide?
Yeah, this is a slide on AATCC Digital Labs. So AATCC Digital Labs are web-based training lectures and informational discussions that explore textile-related topics with industry and academic experts. The online collection covers a number of subject categories, including access to archived content. So definitely visit AATCC's website to start learning today.
And if you have any more questions, reach out to the AATCC staff. And also, as part of the Material Interest Group, if you have any topics that you would like covered or contacts that you'd like us to reach out to present at one of the upcoming meetings, please reach out to Apurva or myself, Christina Rappa. We're more than willing to learn from you and set something up. And with that, we would like to say thank you very much, Dr. Aspelund, for joining us today. It was an enlightening topic about space textiles, and we can't wait to see what happens next.
All right. Thank you very much. It was absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.